session. And right now we're waiting on Councilman Osborne and Councilman Gelser, but I think we're going to go ahead and start the process. And hopefully you won't be too far into it. So the item on the agenda tonight is a presentation and discussion of the history of the city's classification and compensation program. And Juanette Reed, our new Human Resources Director, and welcome.
Thank you.
And is this your first big presentation, isn't it, since you've been here? So
it's been 3 weeks. So.
Yeah. So anyway, don't
this is initiation, isn't it?
don't be nervous, okay? Yeah. And then we have Ruth Ann. Is it Eledge? Is that how you pronounce it? Eledge. And she's from Waters Consulting Group, Inc., and is here to answer also questions. So why don't we just go ahead, Ruth Ann?
I think what I'm going to do, if that's okay, Mayor Lord, is to introduce Ruth Ann and go over the topics of discussion tonight. So again, we're glad to be here and glad to discuss compensation. I think it's something that I know you guys have wanted to discuss, and we're just as excited about it. So Ruth Ann Eledge is from the Waters Consulting Group. She is a vice president and senior consultant for that organization. Waters has been working with the City of Goodyear on our compensation since 2001. The founder, Raleigh Waters, worked with the city back in 2001, and Ruth Ann worked with the city with the last study in 2007-2008. Also, to her credit, she was a former HR director for the City of Austin for 12 years. So that speaks, she can speak to both sides of the consulting and being in a public organization. And just behind me, because I have only been here a short time, I want to introduce Jeannie Ruddy and Vicki Lackey. Jeannie's our Human Resources Manager, and Vicki is our Human Resources Analyst. I may have to ask them some questions, so they're here to help with part of this. So,
great. Thank you.
With that, we're going to go over the purpose of today's meeting. We're going to look at the history of Goodyear's compensation system, review the components of the pay and wage administration, discuss some options in compensation structure and design, receive council direction, at least to have a good discussion around compensation structure, and then talk about next steps where we go from here. So if there's no questions, I'm going to turn this over to Ruth Ann.
Get things organized here. Is that sufficient? Can everybody hear? Okay. First, I want to say I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I have been working with the City of Goodyear over the past several years and have always enjoyed the opportunity to spend more time with you. So thank you for the chance to be here today. I think that it's, I'm going to start with the presentation since when it has already given my introduction. I think it is important to focus and spend your time on compensation. When you think about the dollars that are expended every year on employee pay, benefits, all of the other rewards that you provide employees for incentives, most organizations spend anywhere in the range of 60 to 70% of their budgets on employee pay and compensation. So,
can I interrupt you right there? I need to ask, do you want to go through with your presentation, or can we stop you at any point? So
please stop me.
Okay, well, I'm stopping you right at that one. Okay. So what I'm interested in, is that with municipalities, or is that organizational budgets? Is that across the board?
It's certainly with municipalities, and it's somewhere in the 50 to 60% with private sector. So it depends on the type of organization. Since you are a service type of organization, and public sector generally is, you typically see a little bit more percentage on compensation for them.
Yes, sure.
Well, I have two questions, and maybe one of you could answer. What is our percentage, and why is it more for the public sector? Because you just said 50 to 60 for the private sector, but 60 to 70 on the public.
I believe ours is 62%. About 62%.
What's the difference, though? Sorry. I always have to hold that up. What's the difference between, why is there such a swing between the public and the private?
And excuse me, it is variable, but generally what you'll see sometimes in private sector is they may be more mechanized, they may be production oriented, they don't have as high a level of service. It's a type of employees that they have, that sort of thing. So it varies. I think it's the point really is that it's a significant investment that, whether it's public or private sector, that is being expended on dollars for your human resources. And so taking the time to really focus on it and have a excuse me, a discussion about it is, I think, very important. And I think it's a very useful, from my perspective, it's very useful for your time. And so having that type of discussion also provides some feedback to us on direction about any changes that you may want to consider. Yes, sir.
Just real quick, I know when I was on board, personnel was around 52, 53%, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think part of the reason why it's grown is a lot of the budget has been cut on the services and the type of, product that we produce outside. So we've cut a lot of that down to where we have the bare minimum of a lot of salaries, and a lot of the additional that we were spending on has been cut. Is
You're
that
absolutely
kinda correct?
right, Joe.
Because I
That's
know it was
why
in the 50s.
Yeah, the 62% is where we're at right now, and it is because commodities have been cut and things like that.
So the fact that you are a service organization and that you have employees that are provided and expected to provide high levels of service, particularly here in the city of Goodyear and the Valley, what I've found when I've done work with other public sector, there is a very high level of expectation for employees to provide services, sometimes above and beyond what you would typically see in other public sector organizations. There's also, as part of your discussions, an acknowledgement that sometimes revenues are scarce, and so having a good discussion about strategically expending dollars on your human resources is very useful and thoughtful. Just as a reminder, many of you probably are very familiar with the different components of compensation, but compensation really does have three separate components. Certainly the direct pay, or the wages and salaries that employees receive, the benefits that are associated with their wages as well, and then any other incentives that you provide, opportunities for rewards or recognition for different levels of pay or for longevity or whatever it is that you value in your organization. Today, most of our discussion is going to be focused on the direct pay and the incentive or performance or whatever, or longevity, whatever you value that dictates how employees progress in pay. But I did want to acknowledge that a significant portion of compensation does come through benefits, particularly in public sector. Just a brief review of compensation here with the City of Goodyear over the past 10 years or so. Our experience with the City of Goodyear has always focused on a market-based system. It does have competitive pay structures and pay systems, and market has always been one of the tests to determine where your pay structure should be focused. You do have a step and grade system, and typically the performance here has been based on the movement through those pay ranges and through those steps have been based on performance. And you have annually updated your structures or at least checked the market to see where you are in relation to the pay system and to the market. You had conducted the most recent study in 2008. That's when Waters did an expanded market review. I'm not sure how many of you were here at that time, but at that point we did expand the market some and redefine it, and that was a decision that we brought to council for consideration. And so we'll go over some of that as we work through this slideshow.
I'm sorry, we have a question right here from Joe.
Yes, sir.
Just a real quick one. I know we have a step system, but does our HT system have the capability of picking a number other than 2.5 or 5 for a raise or merit or whatever you want to call it?
Yes, it does. We put that in, we program that in, and it does have the capability of changing the percentages, moving from a step to an open range. It has that flexibility for whatever structure we're directed to implement.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Sorry. Excuse me.
I do have a question. Were you here in 2001 doing that initial?
I was not.
So I'm going to direct my attention to Mr. Dalkey, who was here. Remember the big changes that were made in the pay system back in 2001? There were giant changes. Would there be any value in revisiting why those occurred for the council? I'll just keep doing this. They were huge, and I think it's a value especially where we find ourselves today. We haven't done any employee changes or anything for the last 4 years.
But neither have most others. We can certainly check into that and report back to you what was behind those changes. I'm not familiar with it, having not been here, but we can talk with Brian and other people who were a part of it and get you a report.
I don't want to go as far as a report. If we can see if if it adds any value to the discussion.
What I have been told is that because if you recall the population, Goodyear was a really tiny city in the 90s. Mm-hmm. It started growing rapidly in the 2000s. As a tiny city, Goodyear was not responsive to the pay and benefit needs of the employees. And so we fell very far behind. And so a major adjustment was necessary in order to make the pay plan competitive, as Ruth Ann has just been talking about. That's what I recall about it, but I will get you more detail.
That may be sufficient if that helps lay some groundwork for everybody. I think, Joe, you were here as I was as an employee, and that we were looking at 10% or greater raises for employee groups because they had fallen so far behind in the market. And I think that's good historical value for all of us.
That's a long time ago.
Yeah,
I'm trying to remember. That was 10 years or
that was
12?
2001. It was.
Yeah.
I remember big market adjustment when I came on. I came on in 2005. So somewhere between 2005 and 2007, we lost at one period of time, 13 employees resigned and left the city within a very short period of time. So I guess it was between that and 2008.
Yeah, we had very high turnover during that
Yeah.
period of time. And so the council did another major change in order to address the high turnover. And then we got to a point where our turnover has been very
I think we went up to
reasonable.
106% of the market. Was that?
That was where we went, yes.
Can you believe I'm remembering that?
And we're now down around 100, I think.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, 2006. Yeah, it was full employment, and the 2001 was and I think you're right. So if you can just verify that, I don't think a report is necessary. Just we were right or we were off by whatever.
What you could do, John, maybe is just put the percentages each of those years. I mean,
Sure.
that's easily
Be
done,
happy
and then
to.
everybody can see that.
Be happy
That'd
to.
be great. Thank you. Sorry for, I'm not going to
No,
stop saying I'm sorry, because this is what we want. We want a really good, deep discussion on this, so.
Right, no, and please don't
Yeah,
feel like you're
okay.
interrupting, because the purpose of this is to generate a discussion among, and obtain feedback.
Great, thank you.
Again, just summarizing, we did conduct the study in 2008 and expanded the actual market some from, I think it was either 6 or so to 10 organizations, and reconfirmed the market policy that the council desired, and looked at the exemption status to make sure that everybody's eligibility for overtime was correctly or was appropriately designated, so that you were consistent with Fair Labor Standards Act, and then updated your pay ranges. So that's been your most recent action, at least particularly with Waters Consulting. One of the things that I think is helpful to generate if we move into this discussion about compensation is to talk about some key concepts and components in compensation administration. Generally, compensation is involved with 3 different types of equity. The discussions that we have today are going to surround primarily the individual equity and the external equity. You already have some systems in place that ensure internal equity, which is the relationships of jobs. You have a point factor system that works very well for you, I think, and so we won't go into that component of compensation. But the individual equity and the internal equity, the other 2 pieces that are key to a successful compensation system, really involve understanding and knowing where you are in relation to market and all the policy decisions that go along with that, and understanding also the individual equity, which is the relationships of employees' pay and how they move through the pay structure. So those 4 will really focus our discussions today, where you have some policy that you can provide us feedback on, and the internal equity, which is the point factor system, is applied for your non-sworn jobs. The overall purpose of that is to make sure you understand the hierarchy of jobs within the organization. Your police and fire sworn already have a hierarchy based on their rank system, and that's why it's used just for the non-sworn jobs. So let's talk a little bit about external equity and individual equity if you don't have any questions about that slide. If you move through the key policy issues that relate to market comparison, one of the key policy decisions that a governing body generally provides input and feedback on is who you compare yourselves to, and that's your market policy. Who are your comparators? Who do you want to collect data from to make sure that you're competitive with the market there? And we'll have a general discussion about that in a few moments. We'll also talk about the relationship, once you've determined who you collect market data from, the relationship that you want to have with that market data for your pay structures. And we'll talk again in a few moments about some of the options you have for that. One of the other discussion points that I will just note that's not really a policy issue, but when you're gathering market data, you have the option of using a simple average to calculate the data point for reference, or using a weighted average salary. And in the future, you may want to consider using a weighted average salary, because that is the average salary of all the incumbents that are out there, rather than a simple average of all of the organizations that respond to your survey. But that's something I think can be discussed later on once you talk about who you want to compare yourselves to and what your relationship is to that market data.
Excuse me, so you'll be, that was going to be one of my questions, was a little more explanation on what the weighted average was compared to the market average.
And then really simply, the weighted average is looking at the number of incumbents and looking at the average salary of all those incumbents. So if one organization has 3 incumbents that are making $50,000, and another organization has 1 incumbent making $47,000, you would average all 4 of those salaries versus the average of the actual organizations. So
I just want to note that Councilman Gelser has arrived, and Vice Mayor Osborne has been here for a few minutes. Go ahead.
okay. One of the other things that I'd like to say as a point of discussion is there's really no one right way to do a compensation system. It really needs to be tailored to the organization's individual needs. So as you go through and give us feedback and discussion on this, I will tell you advantages and disadvantages, but there's no really one right way to do it. And so tailoring it to and updating it to meet your individual needs, I think, is another good reason why you want to have this kind of discussion over time. When we get into talking about the next policy area, which is structure design, that's where we'll talk about step structures versus open ranges, the number of structures, how many structures you want to have, how many steps you want to have, the percent differential from within your steps, and those kinds of things. And we'll look at some options for how other organizations provide pay ranges for their employees, and again discuss advantages and disadvantages. And then finally, as we move through this presentation today, we'll talk about pay administration, how you administer your current system, how you keep it up to date, and what opportunities employees have for moving through your pay ranges. This gets down to the individual equity issue that I mentioned earlier, the differences in pay between employees. So we'll cover both external equity of the market and internal equity as we move through these future slides. I wanted to start with external equity. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the key discussions that usually occurs around this issue is who do you want to compare yourselves to? And we call that labor market identification, or market definition in general. And generally, there are some guiding principles that you use to determine who you want to compare yourselves to. Again, there's no right or wrong answer as long as it is principle-based or it's based on a set of criteria. Generally, you look at who you're competing with when you're hiring folks, and who you lose people to when they go to work for someone doing the same job for more money. You want to look at organizations that have similar types of services, organizations that have similar types of demographics as you do. In a few moments, you'll see the list of your current benchmark organizations, and while a couple of those organizations, those cities, are not real close to you, they also had similar demographics, like quickly growing populations and service needs. And so that was one of the criteria that was taken into consideration as we've selected a group of benchmark organizations. How mobile your workforce is and being able to go to those other locations. Sometimes there are factors that inhibit or that also encourage mobility between workforces. A better working environment, more resources, better equipment, higher focus on training. Those kinds of things may encourage employees to go to another organization. Some of the things that may discourage them would be things like a different retirement system, so you're not mobile in your ability to move between retirement systems. So, excuse me, that is all part of what you take into consideration as you're looking at who you want to collect market data from. And finally, there are some limitations on data that you can collect. A lot of organizations are interested in collecting market data from local private sector companies. Unfortunately, they're generally very unwilling to share that data. We've had very poor experience in being able to collect individual organizational data. Now, you can purchase data, and you can even sort it or refine it to this Phoenix area, but it's sometimes difficult to get clear summaries of the work that's being performed so that you're confident that you have good matches. Even some of the private sector data that is published through the government, BLS and some of those others, you can't cut the data in a manner where you're confident that you're doing an apples-to-apples comparison of work. So there are some limitations on where you can gather data from, the cost of it, and the accessibility of it. With all that said, if you'll see on this next slide, the list of your current benchmark organizations, and to the right of it, you'll see that there are the factors that we used in developing the criteria for selection. Again, there's no one right or wrong list of benchmark organizations, but generally they should be organizations that are close by, the data is accessible, you have a high likelihood that you'll have a significant number of matches, so it's worth your time collecting that data. And they are also those organizations that you tend to lose employees to, or that you attract employees from, or you compete with them for that applicant pool. So this is your current list. You'll see the two organizations I was talking about that are a little bit further away but had similar types of demographics, or Chandler and Gilbert. But these are all primarily the Valley cities, and are the ones that were adopted for use in your current benchmark organizations. Any questions? Or
Sherry does.
I do, and anyone who's heard me say this before is that I was a Phoenix employee for 13 years, and I don't see a comparison here for several reasons. First of all, they're the 5th largest city, so I took it above myself to look to see what Goodyear's approximately the 555th largest city in the United States. So, and when I look at like law firms, I'm an attorney, so the ABA does this list, and medical practitioners do these lists where they compare small, medium, and large. So I do have a problem with that with size. I understand what factors you're also looking at. Also, when you take police and fire, I want to talk strictly about office personnel because there is no private sector comparison. Phoenix has in their charter that they have to rate a percentage of private sector with regard, that's a charter requirement. And they have all bargaining units except for except for executive and middle management. Everybody else has a bargaining unit, which we don't have. Mm-hmm. So for those reasons, I personally would like to take Phoenix out of the equation because it's like, measuring ourselves against my law firm of a couple attorneys against, Snell and Wilmer. I'm not going to pay the same. It's just never going to happen. And so those are my thoughts on that. When you hear that, especially the charter requirement as well, pulls in the private sector for them. Joanne?
And I appreciate that. I certainly can understand that comparison. And it's not something that I think Goodyear needs to strive to be the same as Phoenix. However, I just think knowing those figures and those numbers is something that's beneficial to us. Even if you are a small law firm of 2 compared to a Snell and Wilmer, you still like to know what is Snell and Wilmer paying and what are their benefits. Doesn't mean you have to be that, but you need to know that, in a sense, your competitor down the road is where your your secretary or whoever may go to be at. So I don't think it's a comparison in that form, but I think it should be knowledge that you always have.
And you can always throw out the high and the lowest, right? When analyzing it. Joe?
I kind of have a little different perspective. I see local governments as in the business of health and welfare. And when we're looking to hire somebody because of the diverse background of everybody, whether it's somebody at the wastewater treatment plant or somebody at the water treatment plant or the police and fire, I think it's important that we have the best and the brightest in those positions, because if we don't, if we make a wrong hire and we hire the wrong one, it can not only hurt our public at large, but it could have a significant financial impact on our city as well. So when I'm looking at those individuals that actually directly impact the health and welfare, I think it's important, whether they're in Phoenix, whether in Peoria, they have to have the same skill sets. I want the top-notch skill sets for those, so we don't find ourselves in a position where you end up with either somebody doing something they shouldn't be or whatever, because you pay a little up front or you pay a lot down the road if you don't get the right people. So that's kind of my perspective when it comes to the nature of our business and why I think it's important, especially for those touching directly the public, that you have that.
I just want to kind of follow up on that. But I think there is a difference because, for example, I can just say from my experience, I might have done one jury trial a week. These smaller jurisdictions, you may do one jury trial every 5 years. So there is a different skill set. There's a different workload. There's a different volume of workload that I think you have to consider too. And that's what I'm saying. Well, and that's just my thought process there.
Thank you.
And the only thing that I might add to that is sometimes organizations will have certain levels of positions that they use a comparison for and others not. So truck drivers, for example, whether they're in Phoenix or in Peoria or if they're going to be in Goodyear, they generally do, and yes, they may have different frequency of driving or not. I don't know. But that's something for your consideration, something for your thought.
And I think the other thing you did, Sherry, which is private bargaining. They have a lot of outside contracts that we don't have and don't have any intentions of having. They have a number of unions. Well, I don't know if there's a number of unions, but
Except for middle management and executive,
everything else is unionized. So it does run differently.
Let me ask you a big question. Is APS and what's our other large organization here? No, you got it.
River?
No,
Southwest?
CAP or
no. We've got APS. I don't think SRP is here. Is it?
They're over in Avondale.
Okay, or Avondale. Okay, I mean, those are private to extent, but I mean, we can't get that data from a comparison. Or Lockheed Martin down the street, we can't get anything from them either.
It's very difficult.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I can tell you that 50% of our employees on staff in April came from the public sector. About 45 came from the private sector. A large portion of our employees that we hire, about 45% of them, do come from our benchmark cities. And so that's where we're getting a lot of our employees are from other benchmark cities.
Would you say that again? 50 from what?
50% of our employees that we've hired come from the public sector. So they come from other public sector agencies. And when you look at just our benchmark cities, 45% of those are from benchmark cities. So we do hire a lot of employees from our benchmark cities. We still hire from the our private sector because we have jobs that are in the private sector, such as accountants and admin support. But a large portion of our employees do come from the private sector, or public sector, and our benchmark cities.
Thank you.
And I think that type of analysis is extremely helpful in looking at where your employees come and where they go too, because I know they do exit interviews here and determine the reasons for leaving and where they're headed if they can gather that data, and that's all very useful and helpful. So I don't know if there's any other discussion about benchmark organizations. I hear kind of a mixed bag about Phoenix, so I don't know if there's anything more than to acknowledge that, and discussions can continue on the validity of using the city of Phoenix.
Yes, Phil.
The only thought I would have on that is, like we do with the ballpark, our employees per thousand with or without the ballpark. Perhaps any of the future data that we get, we do with or without Phoenix, to see if that changes and kind of educate everybody on that. It's just a suggestion, but
That's a good idea, because since it's one of 10 organizations right now, you can see the actual impact of it. It may not be as significant as you think it is.
I
Do we
suspect
have
it
council
is.
consensus on that one? Sure. Shaking your heads, everybody?
As long as we can see the numbers.
Yeah, we'll see the numbers then, absolutely.
We can provide that easily to you.
Thank you. Be interesting.
Okay, the next area that we'd like to have some discussion with you on is the actual market policy, and that is the relationship of the market data to your pay structures. Excuse me. What you see here is 4 different options that most organizations take into consideration as they're trying to determine their relationship with market. In the past, I think as early as 2001, I think that Mr. Fishback talked about your policy may have been as high as 106% or so of market. And I think over the years, it's gradually become closer to 100%. I think at this point in time, your market policy or your market direction has primarily been focused on evaluating where you are in relation to market at 100% of market average. And I think that is where we are now, and understanding where you are in relation to market at the 100% market average. If there's any other discussion or direction or feedback, generally organizations, most of the ones that I work with in public sector, unless you have, excuse me, have a significant turnover problem or a significant difficulty in recruiting employees, will probably range around the 101, 102% of market. Yes.
What is the market sensitive, and what are the advantages to that?
Some organizations want to have a range around market, and these organizations generally are the market. They set the market because they don't have much competition, and so they feel like they can have that flexibility. They may also put their dollars in other areas like incentives that provide more flexibility in how pay is distributed. They may also put their additional dollars in benefits. So it is a compensation philosophy, if you will, about where you want to place your dollars and your emphasis. If you want to add anything to that. Any other thoughts about your current approach to looking at how you compare around 100 to 101% of market?
Guess we're okay to go on.
Okay, move forward. Okay, so let's move then into discussion, because once you've determined who you're going to collect data from and how you're going to compare yourselves to it, then the next discussion would be around how your structures are designed and and how you determine how you look at the layout of your structures, if you will. Structures are really the pay opportunities for employees, and generally you want to be competitive for sworn positions. You want to have a different relationship or different approach than you do from non-sworn. Non-sworn typically, because you have many positions that are in the same, that share the same range, you really want the middle or the midpoint of your range to be competitive with the market averages. Because if you think about a range of pay, you bring someone in and they move closer to midpoint, and that's generally the more market competitive point. So when we look at the pay structures for non-sworn positions, you look at the midpoint compared to market. And you can use either the weighted average or the simple average salary for that. And you can determine the competitiveness of those ranges. Now, for sworn positions, because each rank has its own range of pay, you can more closely adjust that range to that individual rank. And because there is more or less a prescribed way that sworn positions move through their pay structure, generally coming in as a recruit, moving to an officer or firefighter, and then moving on up the ranks, you want to make sure that your range minimums are competitive so that you can attract and retain employees as they move up through those prescribed ranks in the hierarchy of each individual sworn structure. So that is our approach. That is the way these were set up, and these are now being monitored using that approach. I didn't know if there was any feedback on that. It's a very standard compensation practice, and generally all the pay systems that we set up are using these principles.
Yes, Sharon.
Do we have a policy when we hire somebody? I know it's been a while since we've hired somebody, but if someone's very stellar, do we have to start them at the beginning of the range, or can we start them at a midpoint or somewhere else in the range?
We can start them at a midpoint or somewhere else in the range.
And I guess to verify loud is that we have some new hirees that are making more money than people have been here for 4 years. Is that correct?
That is true, yes.
Okay.
Yes, and that is actually one of the conversations that we'll have a little bit further on,
Yes.
talk about pay administration, because it is an ongoing issue. So one of the things about pay structures is you can look at how they're designed, because that should reflect how you want employees to be compensated over time, how wide your structures are, whether or not you have steps, if you have open ranges. If you have a step, what is the percentage between steps? Currently, you have 2.5% steps, and how wide those ranges are. So these are all pay structure design issues that we'll talk a little bit about now. I'm going to show you some options of how ranges are provided by different organizations, just to throw out some discussion for you. The first one is really how you currently are structured. You have ranges that have steps. I think you have 17 steps in your non-sworn, and you have a variety of steps, different steps for your sworn positions. But generally, you have steps with 2.5% step increases. Now, over time, people can move through those steps, and here with the City of Goodyear, you've moved through based on performance, and those opportunities for movement is if you're not performing, you get nothing. If you are satisfactorily performing or successful, I think is a better term to use, because we want to imply that employees are successfully performing their job. They have a 1-step increase, which is 2.5, or if you are outstanding, you have a 2-step opportunity. And so this is a very commonly used step system that we see a lot, particularly in this region. And I'll show you in a few moments how some of your benchmark organizations are set up. Yes, sir.
Quick question. Right now, what is that breakdown of successful and outstanding as a percentage of our organization?
As the total organization right now for fiscal year 10-11 right now, we have 66% at outstanding, 33% successful, and 1% does not meet.
The reason why I ask that is I know from experience that there are various supervisors that just don't believe in outstanding no matter what you do, and others that have high levels of successful. And from my own personal take, when I see numbers like that, either the goals and objectives are set too low, or we've got a training issue to bring people up to speed on review. I would rather see the successful and outstanding, and this is just my perspective, until that gets fixed, combined to one, in which the goals are set that you have highly competent employees, and call it that as opposed to successful and outstanding. Because in my view, if you get 66% that are outstanding, even though I think we've got great employees, don't get me wrong, I think there's some anomalies there that aren't the norm.
Joe, I thought, and we did these figures because I thought, well, maybe because of the recession, people aren't giving raises now, so they say, oh, it's just as easy to give them an outstanding, but that doesn't hold true, because the 05-06, it was 56.4% outstanding, 06-07, 62%, 07-08, 65%, 08-09, so now merit increases have been suspended, 08-09, 55.4%, 09-10, 59%, and then 10 and 11, 66%. So that doesn't really hold true. And then I was talking to a human resources director, one of my former human resources directors today, and she said, yeah, John, but you need to also consider that you have very low turnover, and you're evaluating people that have been here for a long time, so that might tend to get it up. But I think that this is systemic of training, or lack thereof, and as we've talked previously, our training budget has really been shot to heck, and so it is something that needs to be addressed.
Yes, Sharon.
I agree. I think those numbers, it kind of reminds you of like grade inflation. That, it seems like it seems a little inflated there. And my concern is the employees that are maybe add another, instead of combining, maybe add another benchmark in there, and I don't know how you'll tie it to figure, but if you add another benchmark, then I think you really can bring out the truly outstanding people that are just above and beyond the rest, because you're going above and beyond everybody else, and then you're in there with people who are doing a really good job, but just not outstanding. Like winning an Emmy should be outstanding, and when you put those people in with just kind of the bulk of people, I think their work is kind of diminished, and I think they need to be really highly outstanding. Call something else for the really top cream of the crop.
The excellence.
Yeah, it's-
The people that get the awards, I agree with you.
Well, it's the follow-up, and I think I've had this discussion with the city manager, is if the merit was one amount of money, and to get to the excellence that you're talking about, say the top 10, 15 percenters by category, it would have to be defined, but comes from one-time money that does not add to your base. I don't like the word bonus, maybe stipend, whatever you want to call it.
In Phoenix again, sorry, they called them out-of-step merit pay.
Yeah, but I mean something that is of a one-time money, but you'd have to define it, and I know we're not there yet, but you'd have to define it on the top. I'd even be willing to go to 20, but those percentage by category, because they're all specialty areas. You've got public works that's different than police, which is different than fire, which is different than parks, et cetera. If you take that approach and define by those categories which meets that criteria you're talking about above and beyond, and then in the budget you set that amount, whether it's a 500 stipend, 1,000 stipend, 15, whatever it is, that's something that all employees have a shot at in addition to their merit, but we're down now to 10, 15% of the top performers as opposed to 66. Just a thought.
Yes, Joanne.
Just for definition, when you say successful, to me that means that someone went a little above and beyond the regular duties. When they say successful, do you call successful just a base worker that did what their job description is?
It meets the standards.
Meets the standards. I mean, I see it a little differently. It's kind of back to this is a silly story, but my children in elementary school would get their Make Their Day coupon, and they would make their day if they were a normal kid. Well, I'm sorry, you don't get special points because you were a normal kid. If you did something special, then to me you made your day extra. And so that's why I ask about the successful to outstanding, and I agree with pretty much the sentiments here. What does that really mean?
I personally think, I look at that as, but that isn't the way the system's set up. I look at that as a successful means better than average. I think you need another thing in there. Acceptable, average, meets expectations.
Meets
or something.
expectations.
Acceptable.
Yeah.
So I think you're correct.
At task, or something that's okay.
That's an interesting point because I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm fine. I think
do-
Bill's good.
Go ahead, Bill.
Having obviously lived in this system, what we've just talked about, Joanne's version of, well, I think if you show up every day, that's all you should get. That's the problem with our system, is if I work for Joanne, I'm going to be lucky to get a raise. If I work for Sherry, I might just get the one step. But if I'm really, really close with my supervisor, I can squeak out an outstanding. And that is the problem with our system. It's not just training. So if there's a takeaway from this, I'm begging everybody who's listening to this, it's not just a training system. It's the tools we're using. It's the philosophy that we have as a culture of city employees. It's more than just our benchmark cities and the 2% and the 2.5%. It's a huge, this whole thing is an overhaul.
Yes, Molly.
I have a question. I'm going to address it to Joe, if you don't mind. Do you think the supervisors might be inclined to give their folks an outstanding, since the city has not been able to give any extra money? Or
I can't answer that.
but that could be a call.
It could be. I think, I know when I was there, we had clearly defined goals and objectives. I mean, they were measurable, and you knew whether you got them or not. And I think if you have clearly defined of what you expect of whatever, all right, to meet highly competent, I think you can do that. Now, it gets a little more difficult, I'm sure, with the sworn versus a non-sworn, but I tend to agree with Bill. Part of it is you got to look at the entire overall system
Right.
and define what do you expect out of those employees? And there's too much, in my view, to get to you, Wally, subjectiveness with different supervisors. And that's why I think, to have successful and outstanding, I would like to see something called, highly competent for those two combined, and then look at our 10 to 15 percenters separate for the one-time stipend. But that's got to be at a very high level where the upper management decides by category, who those are, where you get out maybe the frontline supervisors and those individuals that may skew that. I'm sure, look at the awards we give out every year. We've got great employees out there, and I'm sure coming up with the 10, 15 percenters, we saw that at the awards. Man, there's a lot of them out there, so I'm sure that you can find 10 to 15% of them is in there. But I see that difference between the two, and a lot of it has to be styles on who the supervisors are. I'm sure Bill will agree with me on that.
Well, asking the city manager, does each department have a review process and a questionnaire, and, is it standardized to meet?
It's partly standardized, but each department has been developing their own.
And do they run that by the city manager so that you look
They
at
run it
this?
through they get the advice of Winnette and her people, and they get the advice of the city manager's office.
Would it be possible for us just to see a form someday?
Sure.
I think that'd be helpful.
Sure.
At least I would like to see one,
We'll
and
get
so
you a
that
couple.
gives me a better understanding. Okay.
Because each department then will have their own standards.
Right, well,
and so there's,
yeah.
you move from one department to another, you're not really going to know what's from one department to another.
I'm sorry. Performance pay systems are the bane of every manager. I've been doing this for 40 years now and have never found a good performance pay system because of the human nature of the person doing the evaluating. You'd almost have to have a committee set up, and that would be too bureaucratic. But
convoluted.
a committee set up, and then 3 people would rate each of the people, and then you'd average them together and something. But it's very difficult to do a performance system when you're using individuals to do the performance appraisal, and when you have a variety of functions like the city does, many of which are unmeasurable.
Yes, Sherry?
Now, John or Lynette, I don't know where this would go, but as a safeguard, if you see like one department that everyone only gets successfuls, is that something that would call your attention and you'd call that manager in and say, why are you just only giving successfuls? What's wrong? Or why is everyone getting outstandings? I mean, is that something you guys could call in and kind of work with them?
We could, and as I get to understand processes and systems within the city, that's something definitely that I did in Peoria, that's something I'd want to do here, replicate that, is to look at where the ratings are. I think, Councilmember Stipp, you said it initially, this is a big nut to crack, and the performance evaluation tool also needs to be looked at. We need to evaluate that and give our supervisors, set them up for success, and also our employees. And so that's something in our next steps that we're definitely going to need to address, as well as the training. Once we have an idea of what structure you're interested in and how you would like us to proceed, then we can come back with some ideas around how do we evaluate employees, how do we move them through the system, and all of that. But it is a large nut to crack, and we've got a lot to talk about. Yeah,
I guess
it's
what you
big.
want is the employer that really contributes a great deal.
Yes.
Truly contributes.
Yes.
You want that person to be recognized for that, and I guess that's where the dilemma is.
And help those who are struggling to be successful.
Oh, and to find out, what direction do I need to go to achieve that?
And the clearer we can make that, the better for everyone, and supervisors and employees also.
Right.
Well, I
Yes,
would be
Molly.
inclined to just say we need. I personally think we need to treat police and fire differently, because if every one of them are not outstanding all the time, 24/7, since they're our first line of defense to our people. I mean, do they get a super outstanding, or are they just dropped out of the equation entirely?
I'll let our ex-fireman answer that.
Uh-oh.
I disagree.
That
we
they're
have
all outstanding?
we have great people We have a lot of really, really good people. But I have worked, not here in Goodyear, but I have worked with some people who are less than outstanding doing the job. They're capable enough, but they're not. I think we have to be careful of separating police and fire from every other city employee just because we look at the nature of what they do. I think we have to be careful of that. And you know, an outstanding public works person is an outstanding employee, as the same as a fire person would be. The sworn thing gets in the way because of the rank structure, but you don't move through the ranks from firefighter to engineer, engineer to captain, captain to battalion chief very quickly. If you particularly look at our organization, we've got battalion chiefs who are going to be in place for probably the better part of 10 more years. So there will be no upward mobility. So the guys that are coming in, and I say that gender neutrally, but the people coming in from the bottom, if they aspire to be battalion chiefs, are going to have a long road ahead of them in the organization. And that's just the nature of it. So I think
that's the nature of ours, or that's the nature of just.
I think in general too. If you take a look at, you know, I'm going to throw that to Peoria, for example. They only had a handful of chief officers as well. So anybody who wants to move through, if you've got 50 firefighters and you've only got 10 chief officers, what are the chances of everybody making it that far? So if we're relying on them to get to the upper, it's like not everybody can be the city manager. So if we're relying on promotion to rank to be the next carrot for them to reach for, I think we're setting them up for failure. So it's just, you know, my experience would be I would throw caution out there that we say police and fire are different, everybody else goes this way, that we look for a solution that treats all of our employees with some equity. And I think that kind of goes to some of the equity issues that I think are going to address later.
Yes, individual equity.
Can I follow up on that? Yes. I think I kind of agree with Wally to separate out the sworn versus the non-sworn, the police and fire. And my thought process here is I'd like to see some of our compensation with the office staff and the non-sworn kind of mirror more the private sector. I think that's kind of where a lot of things are going right now, to kind of look at more, not just government, whereas there is no difference. There is no private sector equivalent for police and fire. They're so specialized.
Military.
Yeah.
Well, I thought
But yeah.
That's easier to move.
So I don't mind separating. I think that actually might be easier for us to kind of develop something, I guess a system, a range system for two, because otherwise I don't know if it's going to work.
Okay, now I'm getting a little lost here. So, I mean, I thought we already were. We have sworn and non-sworn anyway. But you're saying something different.
You need to talk a little closer.
The way we do our market study is we look at firefighters, we look at police officers, we look at sergeants, we look at captains, we look at blah blah blah, and then we look at office staff, we look at IT people, so we're already looking at all the ranges. My takeaway from what Wally was saying is that we need to set up an entirely separate system for the sworn folks. And that's what I'm cautious about, is if we try to set up a completely independent system just for the sworn people. Their jobs are entirely different. You cannot find a firefighter doing a job that's not fire.
Right.
So
why can't it be different?
it can be, but I think if we look at that and say, look, we're going to make a range for sworn people, we're going to make a range that has a gap of 25%, but if you're in the non-sworn, your gap is only 15% because we think police and fire are special. I think we may be causing a problem there. It's a caution. I'm not saying we should or shouldn't.
Ask.
And that's what I'm saying. That's how I interpreted it. So that's why my answer was what it was.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
You think we can get on now that we understand each other? All right.
I didn't want to muddy the waters anymore, but I didn't obviously understand what you were shooting at,
Okay.
which explains my crazy answer.
So Yeah, we're gonna move on. Do I have consensus? We can move on in this consensus. Hello. Have I got your attention? Can we move on? All right. Thank you. Go ahead.
I just wanted to point out on this diagram, on this graph, you'll see in this particular example, it's 8 steps. I think you know that you're, and that's more common, I think, than when you see 16 steps like you currently have. And again, we'll look at what some of your benchmark organizations are doing in a few moments. But in this example here, what you have is variability of movement in a step system. This is different than a automatic step system that we'll talk about in just a few moments. But I think you've actually already covered a lot of what I was going to cover in this next slide. So it's a good segue into it in that,
But cover it anyway.
there are some advantages in having a combination of variability in step system because it does allow you to differentiate in pay between levels of performance. And it does also provide employees like step systems because it brings some certainty and some predictability to the future. There's only certain types of movement that can occur. You can only, generally speaking, if you have a step system, then either you move the step or you don't, or you can move 2 steps or 3 steps. And so it's a good combination if you want to have something that is more predictable. But it does limit the different types of pay changes that people can get. The option that a lot of organizations have come up with that you've already discussed is to have a lump sum payment or, to differentiate in pay if you feel like there's a need to do that. But in terms of your base pay and movement through the pay range, you are limited to whatever steps you have in place. And so if you're going to have a system like this, you really need to make sure that you have a rationale for the distinctions in pay. Because if you don't, then you create problems for yourself and employee morale issues if you can't justify why you do. One moves 1 step and another moves 2.
I don't know if this is the right place to bring this up, but it's going along with the conversation, is that in police and fire, they have other requirements like the military. We call them fill the blocks in the military. So they have certain training issues and certain schools and certain things they have to do. So if the budget prevents them, or say a course, an educational course, so we end up not having everybody qualify at the time that they probably should be up. You know what I'm trying to say?
We refer to that, Madam Mayor, as specialty pays.
Okay.
And the specialty pays have not been affected by the budget decisions.
And
They're all paid.
So I'm just going to use our hiring a chief. How many individuals in our police department were ready to move up to that spot that we could hire within? So I guess that's my question is are we doing the job that we should be doing, that we would have more resources within our police and our fire to move up into these higher positions? And somehow I see that we didn't have that. So I'm asking, is this tied to this in any way?
I think it is, and we've asked Lynette to, on her work plan, is to develop a succession planning, because our organization is just like many other organizations. A lot of baby boomers are going out and are going to retire, and they're going to leave the organizations that they're in. Some are as high as 55%. I mean, that's going to be a horrible wake-up call. So Lynette is going to put together some succession planning. There was a phased implementation for succession in the police department. Unfortunately, that fell apart.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Thank you.
So I think that pretty much covers both the advantages and potential disadvantages of a variable step increase or step range. The next design that I wanted to offer up as an option is an open range. This is the opposite of of what you have currently in place, where there are no steps. It does provide you with much more flexibility in your pay administration. You can pick any point based on some criteria where you want that employee's pay to be when you hire them, or you can give them any type of % increase. So you do have maximum flexibility, and basically you use the market to establish the range of pay, and the midpoint is what is competitive, which is similar to what you do now. You just use steps instead, and you adjust the ranges to maintain a competitive range for folks.
So would this be more flexible, like if we got back, and not that it's going to happen anytime soon, an overheated economy like we did in 2006, 2007, would this be more beneficial to maintain employees, something like this?
Well, I think you can argue both sides. What I will say is it gives you a lot of flexibility in how you establish pay. You're not hinged on the exact step. You can place an employee's pay anywhere in the range, and you can give them any type of percent increase or even lump sum increase if you choose to go that way, which I don't necessarily recommend. But you do have a lot of flexibility, and it allows you more flexibility in your budgeting process as well. In fact, I'm going to move on to the next slide, which talks about the advantages of that. You have maximum flexibility in the movement through the range as well as the placement within the range, and it allows you to adapt to budget restrictions so that if one year you can only give a 2% increase or another year you can give a 4%, or if you want to have a maximum variability in the individual pay changes, you can do that as well. You're going to have to provide oversight in those pay changes because you are providing yourself with a potential liability. So you really need to have a good, strong oversight in place, and you need to be able to defend any changes in pay and the placement of pay. So that if you did, for example, bring in a new employee at a higher rate than a current employee, and it wasn't based on fiscal restriction, it was based on skill level or experience or whatever, you would need to have clear guidelines on how you determine the placement of that position. But you'll see this type of system more often with exempt and sometimes non-exempt jobs. Most of the time you'll see generally step systems with your sworn structures, and then this type of system with your non-sworn, exempt, and executive, and sometimes non-exempt. So, but it is an option, and it is something.
Question: you could still have that problem with a step system.
You can.
I mean, you could bring, if somebody's at step 1 and you bring somebody new from the outside and you bring them in at step 3, you could have somebody who's been there for 4 years making less than somebody you just hired with a step system as well as the open range.
That's true, and in fact, you have that happening now.
I know.
That's correct.
Well, in fact, right now is the dangerous time because we haven't had increases in 4 years. As positions turn over, you have to recruit, and you end up paying more than the person who's been here for 4 years working.
And I assume we have some numbers on how to fix that.
On how to fix the compression issue?
Well, not necessarily the compression issue, but areas where you have individuals making more or less that are supervising people.
We call that a sub-step system.
Yes, I wouldn't say we have numbers on it. We're working to identify those, however.
Okay.
An open range with no steps is an option for consideration. And finally, the last one that you commonly find in public sector is a step system that has automatic step increases. And you see this a lot where you have difficulty with there's no variability in performance. The jobs are fairly routine, rote, or there's not an opportunity for varying levels of performance. And so as an employee comes in, they just generally move on through, and there's a prescribed number of frequency of movement through the pay structure. Some organizations will have skilled or even frontline employees that they bring in and move them fairly quickly for a certain number of steps. They may have a step movement every 3, 6, or 9 months, or even more frequently than a year, until they get to a certain point in the pay structure, and then after that the time may slow down. But it is an automatic. It's very predictable. It's easy to budget for. An employee knows where they're going to be once they move into the system because it's already laid out for them, and a lot of folks like this type of predictability. But it does, as you'll see on the next slide, you can't acknowledge differing rates of pay based on anything except for the time in that position. It doesn't differentiate based on performance, and you have very little flexibility in your budgeting process or your decisions on how that employee generally moves through the pay ranges. But for some positions, it seems to be successful for them. Yes.
Currently, we have, 16 ranges? 16 steps?
I think there's 17 in your exempt and non-exempt.
Is it 17? How many other jurisdictions that we compare against have 17 steps?
None.
None? Okay.
What's the average?
And that's actually a great segue into the next slide,
great.
because we're headed into what other organizations in your benchmark cities do. This first slide is about what other organizations do with their sworn structures. The majority of your benchmark cities do have step systems for their sworn positions. 6 of the 10 have them for police sworn, and 7 of the 10 have them for fire. In all the sworn pay systems, Goodyear has more steps than your other benchmark cities. You can see the benchmark cities range from 2 to 9 for police. You have 14 to 16 here at Goodyear. The benchmark cities range from 1 to 10 for fire, and you have 11 to 16. So you do have more steps. You do have more steps, and their steps are generally 5%, where yours are 2.5%.
May I ask a question?
No. Yes, of course
Can you tell me why we have so many steps? And why we're the only city with so many steps? And was your company the one that recommended it?
I think the decision was made that to make it sustainable and affordable, that they would have, it's a similar size spread, it's just more individual steps, because they're 2.5 versus the 5%. So you're matching the entry and the maximum generally with your competitors. You just have the movement through them, the number of steps and the size of the steps are different to make it more affordable. That's why most organizations do that.
And how long?
You're saying we're the only ones.
In theory, and this is not on someone who was here at the time, in theory, this system works very well. You have half the steps would be 8 from 16. Well, you have 2.5% steps. If you divide, multiply times 2, they're 5% steps. So we'd have the same system. What this allows us to do, and what the council considered and decided back then, from what I've been reading, is that this allows more of a performance-based measurement system. It allows you to say, okay, Joe, you're going to get 2.5% unless you do this, 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 and this. Susie, you're going to get 5%. So that's what it's designed for.
I tend to agree with that, but when 66% are getting the highly competent, to me, I think you got to have some training. You got to boost up those goals and objectives so that you make them 5, but the goals and objectives are boosted to get there. Because right now, if 66% are qualifying for that, there's something. So I think with a little more probably training through the system and getting some clear, concise goals, or what do you expect out of those different, you can actually cut it in half and accomplish the same thing. Unless I'm missing something.
Joe, I think if you recall, we used to have 3 steps, 2.5, 5, and 7.5. And 7.5 was the golden ticket. But for the most part, most employees ended up with the 5%. And I think if you go back to that historical, if everybody's getting 5%, then the steps and everything else, that makes sense. But the minute that we eliminated the 7.5 and went to the 5 and didn't change the number of steps, then we put the whole structure in jeopardy. And so I think it made sense probably back in 2001 at 3, having 3 steps available, but we changed the rules halfway through and didn't change the playing field.
That's why I was suggesting you set the benchmark, because we want the best and the brightest at highly competent for the 5, and then you have that outside the norm that doesn't affect your base salary but one-time money for those exceptional 10, 15%ers, but which has to be defined at some point. Again, it's got to be by category, because a top fire is not the same as a top police, it's not the same as a top public works, not the same as a top parks, it's not the same as a top, variety. But I think I think there's going to be training and a revamping of the system to do that. But I think you take, and again, I agree with the manager, with humans dealing with it, it's never going to be perfect, and I think that's why you see the 66% in there. But I think with the training, and you get the goals and objectives clearly, and the employees clearly understand what's expected of them, so they know what to shoot for. And not only that, they know what to shoot for to get in that top 15 or 10 or 15% through communication into a training program. I think that's viable. Again, that's just my perspective there.
Yes, City Manager.
Madam Mayor, if I could just try this on for size, is what you're looking for, if you have 5% steps and only 8 of them, to be like most of the other cities. I would suggest that what you will end up with is almost all employees getting 5% a year. And there's no way to reward that truly outstanding employee, and as you all know, we have some truly outstanding employees. Or are you trying to...
No, I mentioned you could do it with that 10 to 15. There's still another category, but that's one-time money, not adding to the base. There's still a way of doing that in my suggestion, but it's not adding to your fixed cost. It's a one-time amount of money that it would be in the budget to award those 10, 15 percenters or 15, 20 percenters, whatever the case may be. So there's still a capability of those employees getting a one-time stipend.
Okay, so what you'd be looking for is to keep 5% steps, 8 of them, or whatever, and then have the ability to go into a $1,000 outstanding bonus fund.
Stipend, I don't know if bonus is the right word, but for those 10, 15 percenters. But also, I'd like to put another caveat. I don't want to throw another fly in the ointment, but if you go from 0 to 5, to me, the downside on that is it still has to be budgeted. So you got to have the flexibility to say this year, especially in this economy, this year 2.5 is all we can afford. For that, it's 2.5. Where it's 3.2, it's 3.2. If it's 1 point, you got to have that flexibility. Otherwise, it'll be 0 or 5. Because if you can't afford 5, it's 0. So I think you got to have the capability of working within that system as well, because to me, you haven't done anything as far as pay for for 4 years. If you go from 0 to 5 and you can't afford 5, then you go 0, then you got 5 years with 0.
Okay.
So I think you got to have some flexibility in the system as well.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Gelser, did you have something you want to say?
Yes, I think there's an issue with the evaluation system, and I want to follow up what Councilman Pizzillo said. If we go to an 8-step program and figure out what the percentage raise will be, one, we have an opportunity to budget. If we also have a pool of money that each department or supervisor can give to their outstanding employees, we will come back to having a more statistically sound evaluation system. Our evaluation system is so skewed to the left, it's statistically unreliable. And council has had the statistical analysis discussion. Some of them don't believe that the numbers work, but we do have 500 employees, which is a solid sample. So that if you get 5 to 10% of outstanding employees and they share in a pool and everybody else gets whatever the budget, if they're satisfactory, whatever the budget is that's recommended for a raise or for that step, then I think we might actually get back to having a good performance evaluation and a good merit raise system.
Lynette, if I could, do you have any estimate on how many evaluators there are in our performance evaluation system with 500 employees?
I'm looking to my backup here, and it doesn't look like we have an idea of how many
It
evaluators.
would be quite a few, I believe.
And I would say your supervisors, anybody with supervisory responsibility would have the responsibility to do evaluations if it's a true, full functioning supervisor. So that would quite a few.
It just makes it that much more difficult.
Yeah, I would think average 7 per line staff. You divide 7 into 500 on average, probably before you get a frontline supervisor or something. That'll probably give you an idea.
Thank you.
Can I jump in here?
Yes, go ahead, Sherry.
I guess one of my concern is when we break off sworn, I really like the open range for non-sworn, but sworn, I really think we kind of need to be kind of on track with the other systems because there's such a high cost for training police and fire, and nobody wants the policeman whose first day on the job is, or the fireman, no offense, whose first day on the job there. You really need highly skilled people in those areas, and they're not going to come from the private sector. They're not going to come for everywhere else. And I don't want to see Goodyear to be the place where new hires come, we train them, we spend $100,000 in the academy.
The other city.
Yeah, and then they go, well, in Goodyear, for me to max out, I'm a new guy, I'm going to have to be here for 16 years. But if I go to Phoenix, I can be there 8 years. So I'll go get on with Goodyear. I'll send them through the academy, get my credentials, get my classes, and then I'm going to go over to Gilbert.
Well, I
or
would say
Glendale.
that happens once in a while.
And I just don't want to see that happen. I think we stay with the 16. That's my concern.
Madam Mayor, if
Yes.
I may, that may happen once in a while, but if you look at the way it's supposed to work, if 66 2/3 are outstanding, 66 2/3 of those employees will get through in 8 years. They will go through.
They will get through in 8
at the
years.
same pace as in any other city, and that's why Goodyear has not been a contributing agency to other agencies. We have been an agency that's taking from other agencies to the city of Goodyear. Now, that may change, but
I keep hearing they aren't getting through. I mean, that they're in steps much too long, so
I personally would rather see 8 years and 5%. It makes sense, and then we're competitive with all of the other West Valley cities. And I do understand where you're coming from. And if you do all of this, you're supposed to be able to move up. But if I'm going to hire on, I'm not going to wait 16 years to get to where I want to get. I want to be able to see it in my lifetime at a reasonable number. 8 sounds great. And I don't mind staying at the top for the last 10 years of my career. But I don't want to still be 12 steps down and no hope of getting up. I just can't. I've never worked. I've worked for state government, and of course we never had that many steps. And that's why I just don't understand how we got in the position that we're the only city with 17 steps that may have saved money. And I think now we need to rethink this and perhaps move forward.
and I certainly think that's a valid policy discussion for the council to have.
Joanne?
Just one quick thing. I understand what you're saying, Wally, with the 8 steps. This step system, quite frankly, for me is pretty new. You know, I pay people by performance. And but back to what Joe said, and this is my only, I guess, concern about the step system, is that flexibility. Because what if somebody is doing a good job but isn't worth 5%? I guess that's why I see those. I'm not saying stick with what we have. I'm just, maybe that's why we've had these other steps, is because then there's that flexibility of the 2.5%. So back to what Joe was saying is, how do you get that flexibility in there, even if we go to the 8-step system? How? Because if somebody's not ready to go up a full step, which is worth 5%, then they get 0. So that is a concern of mine.
Just from my perspective, if they don't meet that high standard and quality to get the 5, the question is do you want them as a Goodyear firefighter or police officer? So, that's kind of my perspective.
I'm sorry,
okay.
but then that's separate again. Are you separating again then between the sworn and basic administration, non-sworn?
My only concern is in this market, in this economy, there's going to be times where you're not going to be able to hit the whole step, and I think it's a valid goal to shoot for. But my concern is to still have that flexibility so that you can give something if you have something to give, and say, well, it's 0 this year, and in 2 years it will be 5 because it could have been 2.5 and 2.5. I don't know about the others, but if it was me, I'd have rather gotten 2.5 and 2.5 instead of 0 and 5. So I'm just thinking the flexibility of being able to do that, because we've done nothing for 4 years. You've got people here with 4 years worth of experience that are getting paid the same as new hires. They could go anywhere at step 1 with 4 years of experience. If we don't do anything this year, it'll be 5 years. So I think flexibility is important, even though I think we have too many steps. I agree. I mean, it's not competitive with the others. So we've got to do something. And I think flexibility, and I haven't seen the numbers. We haven't seen the numbers. We don't know what's in the budget. We don't know what's available. But if 5's not available, do you want 0 for another year? Just throwing it out.
Well, I think we have consensus. We have to do something. So I think you're absolutely right. So I think we've made that step ahead. Sherry?
I have a question. Could we do something like that? If you set it up on a 5% step system, can you put a caveat that the city manager can reduce that or council can reduce that if budget, if we go into another recession or something? What is the authority?
Yes, you can direct the city manager, and in the ordinance that you just adopted for the meet and confer, even with an MOU, there's the ability for the city manager to go back and work with the organizations on that amount. So there is that flexibility within the meet and confer, and obviously if you
Because
can...
of the lack of money. Excuse me.
Bill?
You know, Joanne, you were talking about the steps and the employee being good enough to get a single step. If we are able to shrink from 16 to 8, I would hope that we're going to look at employees who are able to continue to hold their jobs successfully, that they would meet that step process. That the outstanding people, I think, is what Joe is getting at, is they are the ones who deserve the, whatever we're going to call it, the excellence award comes in the form of cash, but whatever that is, but that we start to look at our employees as, if you're continuing to have a job, you're doing okay, and that we hold them to a standard that they remain employed.
That's the point. So they're holding them to a standard that if quite frankly you're not reaching that 5%, then there's a failure here somewhere.
Then you probably shouldn't be working, is where I'm going. So if you're 0, you probably have some paperwork around HR's arena that says you've got this amount of performance left. That's kind of what I'm driving at.
Can we move on now, please?
Yeah, I think what I heard from this discussion is there's an interest in looking at the design. You're still interested in a step system for the sworn positions, that you're interested in having a reduction in the number of steps and perhaps the percentage of step increases. And I didn't hear if there's any discussion or interest in having anything beside either as a 5 or a 2.5 if you wanted to phase in something. But all that part of the discussion can occur as you're looking at the cost of it.
Yeah.
Because there'll need to be a transition plan to whatever you what to adopt and how you would transition into it. Okay. Again,
I have a question. What percentage gets you from the minimum to the maximum? And my question has been, and I don't know if this is true, but is it, if you get a 5% raise every year at the end of 8 years, you will hit the maximum? Is that the way the system is designed? So that's the spread on every job that we have. That's
actually, it would be 7 years because you start on step 1, and then you'd move to 2 and 1, 3, 5, and so forth. So you would get there in 7 years if you had 5% every year.
okay. Thank you.
And theoretically, you are a journeyman by that time.
I'm sorry, what did you say, John?
Theoretically, you are a journeyman by that time.
Okay, all right.
And that's assuming you have a supervisor who's willing to do that for you.
Well, that's a training issue now.
It's the human nature aspect of
Yeah,
it.
yeah, it's human nature, but it's also training.
I still would rather go back to what Councilman Pizzillo said, and I believe if the step system is the way we're going to go, I can support that. I really do think we should have a pool of departmental money that is basically bonus money, and that goes to the 10% who are outstanding employees, and that's at a department head discretion with input from supervisors. And yeah, it's going to be subjective, but there is going to be criteria for it, and that's going to reward the people who are above and beyond. Because statistically, yes, I know everybody is above average. I haven't met a grandchild that is below average. So,
And you come from Minnesota.
yeah.
Well, I guess budget-wise, that certainly simplifies things.
Could I ask one quick question?
Yes.
John, I would like to know, and not tonight, but I'd like you to get the information for me. I'd like to know by department how many employees are outstanding.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Okay, the only other point about this is like most of the other organizations that you compare to, they do use a performance component to determine the eligibility for the step increase. So, and what I heard from you here is that you want to continue that as part of the criteria for movement. Okay. Moving on to the next slide, for non-sworn employees, half of your benchmark cities have open range systems for non-sworn positions. So 5 of 10 have open ranges for their non-sworn positions. 3 of them have a mixture of non-sworn positions in either steps or open ranges. So you can see here that in other organizations there's more flexibility, more variety of use. And like Goodyear, 2 of them have benchmark cities that have step systems for their non-sworn. So all but 1 of them, again, use performance or a combination of performance and longevity to determine increases. But you see a variety of approaches to non-sworn positions. And this is what I see also when I'm across the country doing studies is depending on the culture, your values, your goals and objectives, you may have a system for one set of positions and something different from another group. Any questions or any thoughts about that?
I have one, if you don't mind.
Yes, ma'am.
And I'm only going to throw this out because I'll go with however council would like to do. But I would like to see the non-sworn for Goodyear be based on performance and longevity. And if you look at this chart, it tells you what cities are doing that. Ours is only performance only. So that you don't get, it would appear that if you aren't doing outstanding work, you don't get a raise.
I prefer performance.
Well, there again, it's in the supervisors. It's in, it's by that determination.
I think it's got to be in the goals and objectives, and again, a training issue, revamping the process so that, there's nothing, it's amazing. I can't remember many years ago, one person sat me down, didn't see him for 2 weeks, and another person who spent 1 week explaining the whole organization. So I think a lot of it has to do with the training, communications, and clear and concise when they're expected of the employee. If there's nothing worse than after a review, the employee says, I didn't know I was supposed to do that. So it's real important, again, training, and the employees clearly know what's expected of them to meet certain criteria. And again, I realize the human nature in there, but to me, that's going to have to be worked on through a training process.
And I would agree. I like the performance, and I think your supervisors, part of their evaluation should be sitting down, at a midpoint to make sure everyone's on track. And at the end, I used to supervise people, and we would meet them. We use the performance evaluations. I would meet with them. Originally, we would set their goals together. Everyone would sign off on it. Then we would meet midway through the year, make sure we're on track, make any adjustments, because sometimes you'd have goals that you set up people to do, and that project, just whatever reason, that project would have gone away. And then you meet again at the end of the year. So you're not setting them up for failure, and I think it is a training issue. And then I think I would be okay. And there was also basically, I don't really say an appeals process, but a process where someone could write their opinions to the evaluation and attach it, and then I guess if there was a problem, go to the other supervisor above it, if it seems out of skew.
I prefer performance.
Yeah.
Me too.
So because while I did ask the question, the consensus of the
Performance.
council is performance. Councilman Gilzer?
Yeah, I can live with.
Okay.
He can live with either one.
And
probably.
you're flexible, Molly. You said either way. Is that right?
Absolutely.
All right.
Is there any interest in any other type of structure design change? Is there any interest in moving away from a step system, for example, or changing the design of it like you're considering for the sworn positions?
I kind of like the open range, or at least to get some numbers on an open range system, because I really think that gives so much more flexibility as the market adjusts, that if we do get in an overheating market again, like you said, people were leaving, we can make those adjustments right then and there.
flexibility. What is, yes, Gary?
I would actually like to see an open range system for non-sworn employees, and that council would have when the budget comes up, we can determine whether we're going to go with, the normal step versus the sworn employees, where we're going to try to work with the step system and some type of a bonus program. Again, I just think we need to be able to tie our evaluations. If people want to pay for performance, then we have to have our evaluations that reflect what the performance actually is, not what the perceived or what I need to get as performance so I get a raise or get promoted.
Well, let's get consensus on that. Are you nodding your heads? Would you like them to bring that forth so that we can take a look at that along with that?
I'd like to see it.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
not
that's what I'm not you're saying. I know what you're saying.
That we're
It's
gonna go with it.
that's right, but it's another thing that because tonight's been a lot of discussion. So when you bring that forth, we'll actually be really focusing on in two defined areas. It would. Okay, I think so. Does that work with you, John?
Yes.
Okay.
So my challenge then is to summarize what I
Yes.
thought I've heard so far, and with that, you and I can both cover this slide, and then I'm going to hand it back over to her to close out the rest of the discussion. What I heard is that in terms of market comparison, that you're pretty comfortable with the benchmark organizations. You would, however, like to see the data with and without the City of Phoenix included so you could see the impact of that market information. But there wasn't any other questions about the rest of the benchmark cities. You were also comfortable using the current market definition or policy, which is at market or around 100 to 101% of market, and seeing that. And of course, all this will be presented. I'm saying this for one but and for the manager, but will be presented within your budgetary constraints, so you'll see what the impact is. When it comes to structure design, there's an interest for exempt and non-exempt to look at both step and open ranges, and so that will be an opportunity for you to review further. That for sworn police and fire, there's an interest in reducing the number of steps and increasing the size of the step, and looking at that and how you could transition into that type of system while still providing flexibility. And that's going to be a little bit tricky, but there's some ways that you can do that, and providing the opportunity for more discussion about the performance system, the training that's going into it, the monitoring that is being used as oversight for it, and the opportunity for recognizing the truly high performing employee, that top 10 or 15%, and that would be possibly in the form of a stipend or a bonus of some sort. Let's see. There's an interest in still continuing focus on movement through the system based on performance. Again, looking at your performance system and how it's managed and implemented. And I guess those are the key feedback that we've received. Did I miss anything, Lynette? I'm going to pass this over.
Bill? Bill?
I'm looking at the with and overlap issue. If I remember correctly, in this last budget discussion, the fix that was made to the ranges for police and fire was to fix the compression.
Yes. That's what
Partially, but it was going after the compression. Whatever step system we are looking at, I guess I want to make sure that we avoid recompressing, if that's such a word, or how we work the system out so that we don't end up with supervisors making less than their employees, which I may have been the case in the past. I don't know if it's been fixed or not, but so however we work those steps, I think we've got to make sure that we pay very close attention to that, and I really want to make sure that that's kind of noted tonight, so that we don't get jammed up again.
I think we have, I see heads not, I know she has it. I just want nodding of heads, what Bill said. You agreement with what he's asking? Mm-hmm. Gary?
Yeah, I want to follow up on that.
Okay.
We have an issue, and along with what Councilman Stipp said, we have an issue because we have new employees who are making more than 4-year-old employees. So when we do the grand fix for next year, we need to that's another issue that is going to need to be looked at and worked into the overall budget, so that we get back to a 4-year employee is making more than a first-year employee, no matter how their performance was or should be.
Sure, and I'm sorry, were you going to?
I was just going to say, Gary, I hope your optimism is right that the grand fix is next year, but I'm not so sure.
Well, okay, the grand fix may not be next year, but if we get halfway there next year on next year's budget, we're moving in the right direction, because for the last several years, all we've been doing is treading water and surviving. And, at this point in time, assuming that we don't have a drastic, relapse, we should be able to get ourselves back into a little healthier position budgetarily.
Wally, you had something to say?
I was just going to say, when we have the next discussion, I'd like a cost of what it would take to implement this in its entirety.
And some of the issues you're raising, like the differential from one rank to the next in the sworn structures, is a design issue. But some of it is also the lack of funding. And so when you go without pay changes for several years, even the best system will become in disarray, because you have to hire people. And the only way to do that is to pay the market rate, even if you can't afford to bring the rest of your other folks up. So there's a couple of ways, to deal with compression issues, and then also to deal with design issues.
Even our compression issue had to be taken care of in 2 years, not just in. So.
All right, well, we're getting close here. I just want to, first of all, this is a slide you saw previously from Ruth Ann, and I just really want to say thank you. We appreciate this discussion. I think it's been very good. Again, you've wanted to have it, and we've wanted to have it with you. So Ruth Ann has talked pretty much about the direct pay and the incentives, and there's a third component to our total compensation, and that's a benefits area. So I just want to take a few more minutes to review some additional policy items we'll need to focus on as we progress towards preparing next year's fiscal budget. And some of you may be more familiar with this list than others. Just kind of walking you back through what we have done to manage compensation during the economic downturn. It goes back to July 1st of 2008, where we suspended merit increases. And then shortly after that, a year later, in July of 2009, there was a suspension of the market adjustments, tuition reimbursement, reduction in the fire uniform allowance, and a suspension of the automatic time and a half for working a holiday, along with the police officer hiring bonus. And then effective July 1st of 2010, there were suspensions of longevity pay, retirement health savings account, criteria-based promotion program, and the vacation cash-in. So we've managed the downturn, but there has been an impact to employees as we've done so. With the suspension of the merit and market adjustments, non-sworn employees' average base pay has not changed since July 1st of 2008. Now, their adjusted net pay has continued to decrease, and a lot of that's due to the changes in the retirement system and health insurance cost. As many of you know, ASRS changed the contribution percentages this past year for, it used to be 50-50, employer paid 50%, the employee 50%, but that's gone to a 47%, 53% split. In PSPRS, there's been an additional 1% contribution for employees every year beginning this year and will continue through the 2013. So with those changes, along with health insurance premium increases, which we're not immune to, other organizations have struggled with this, the net average pay decrease for non-sworn employees has been about 5%. and the sworn employees 2% decrease. And now the reason and the difference there is we have done some compensation adjustments for our sworn individuals, so that's the 2% there for sworn employees decrease. But then you need to factor in the reduction in the uniform allowance and the suspension of the time and a half on holiday. So that kind of brings it back a little bit more, along with other employees in the organization who work a 24/7. It's not just the sworn with the suspension and the holiday pay. So we've made some significant changes in the impacts to employees, about 2 to 5%. There's also the other, if I'm going too fast, I'm watching the clock here, and please feel free to interrupt me.
Keep going faster.
Oh, keep going faster, okay. Of course, with other economic indicators, the cost of living, that continues to go up, and employees do watch that. I mean, it's significant, and it means their dollars are going less farther, but that's also with our citizens. It's with everybody. We're watching the dollar shrink, so it definitely impacts everyone. So since July of 2008, since we've suspended the market and merit, 67% of our employees are below the midpoint of their range, and this is where we get into some of those compression issues that you were talking about. 21% of our employees are at the entry step of their range, and the compression issues with newly hired employees making the same as individuals who've been here 2, 3, and 4 years are definitely something that we're going to need to grapple with as we move forward into the next budget year. So last, you saw this slide with Ruth Ann, but I thought it was good to bring it back up. We are a service organization, and our employees do provide the services to our citizens. And as Mr. Fischbach brought up, the Citizen Satisfaction Survey, which, by the way, you'll be presented the whole survey on December 12th, so you'll have all of that presented to you. But some of the wonderful results of this survey we heard at the Employee Recognition lunch. And overall citizen satisfaction with city performance in the delivery of services is up 2% from this last survey. Goodyear as a place to live is up 4% from the last survey. Attitudes about neighborhood safety, up 4%. Treated professionally and courteous, up 5%. And needs handled in a timely fashion, up 11%. I think that speaks volumes for our employees and what they've been able to do asked to do more with less, and I think it speaks volumes of the character of our employees and investing in our employees. And that's why this conversation has been very valuable for us, and we do appreciate your time. Finally, next steps, we'll work on those structures and we'll bring them back to you with some cost and what that might look like and options. Council then will set priorities for funding. We will also work on that performance appraisal form to that tool that we evaluate employees with. And then we'll also conduct the annual survey and benefits survey, which will be going out here in December, compiled in January, and to you by February. So with that, I finished the presentation, and if there's any questions or comments.
I think we're questioned out. Is that right? Has everybody had their last question?
We have one.
Oh, Bill has one more.
The benefit, the tuition reimbursement and some of those other benefits that I think we've talked about before, will we get information on what that might cost to put back into place this year?
Absolutely. That will be part of a next upcoming workshop. We have numbers for all of those, what it would cost to put them back in place, what it would cost to put them partially back into place, and all of that.
Okay, thank you. That's definitely what I want to see.
Yes, Wally.
John, does that include the uniform allowance given up by fire and the,
Yes, it does.
bonus pay? Thank you.
All right.
Well, options to choose from.
Well, we can't thank you enough. This was really a great discussion and well presented. We congratulate both of you. We have no information items. We'll go on to the next. Yes, I'm sorry.
Sorry, is there another item?
Not that I'm aware
I was
of.
just going to ask, George and I were talking that we needed to have is this on the agenda? We needed to discuss work sessions and how they went. And I said, it'd be great to have a work session on a work session. So ask you, how did this go?
Oh, thank
What-
you, John.
what
I
did
forgot
we
about
not
our
do?
discussion.
What would have been more helpful?
Yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah, so we have a few moments here. Let's just get some feedback from you on these work sessions. Yes.
Actually, I like the fact that the slides were few but very, very detailed, or not detailed, but very informative, and that the way they were broken up, it was easy for us to ask the questions and cover those slides because it was a national progression. So I thought it was done very, very well. I also think the time-wise, if you have typically a slide presentation that even if you ran through it was 15 or 20 minutes and you have 2 hours to talk, we're coming in under that, and I think we had a very good discussion tonight. So I think this one was a very good work session as far as the number of slides, how it was condensed, and how the discussion ensued as a result of it. So I give it 2 thumbs up.
Other comments? I just appreciate that you're all contributing to this, and nobody's hesitant to say how they feel, and I think it just makes it a better discussion. The outcome will certainly show that. Wally?
Well, I really like having 2 hours for a work session for something this involved. I always...
As important as this one
This is so important, and it's very hard to get everything in an hour. And as you know, and I know the public knows, the council cannot talk among themselves about anything, except maybe how our children are or something. But this really allows us to listen to each other and see where they're coming from. And while not all of us have our minds made up, we get a different perspective, and I really appreciate that. So I really am grateful that this was a 2-hour, and I thank you, and it was a wonderful presentation for your first one to us. You did good.
Great.
And I just want to compliment as well, because I like the fact we got to talk and it just wasn't somebody reading slides, because I do find that if someone just sits up there and reads a slide, I like the fact you highlighted the points on the slide and we could move off of those and follow up. Every single word wasn't on the slide, so I think that's so much more helpful.
So with that, this meeting's adjourned.
Good job.
Oh, yes, we have 10 minutes here. 6 o'clock, we'll be back.